In the cradle of mountains where empires died and languages were born, a silent code endures, not etched in stone, not sung in poems, but written in the double helix of blood. For centuries, the Kurds have lived without a country. The world has known them through rebellion, through resistance, through exile. But that is not where their story begins. Their origin stretches deeper, far beneath flags and fire. The real story of the Kurds was never fully told, because it wasn't in the chronicles of kings. It was hidden in their DNA. In the northeast of Iraq, beneath the jagged ridges of Sulaymaniyah, scientists began to search, not for political answers, but for ancestral ones. They collected blood, not from politicians, not from generals, from shepherds, from teachers, from men whose families had never left these mountains for 1,000 years. And from their blood, a map began to emerge, not the kind you can draw, but the kind you can feel, a lineage older than memory. At first glance, Kurdish DNA seems familiar. A blend, they said, a mixture of West Asian peoples. But as they looked closer, the truth became more complex, more ancient, more defiant, because these mountains, these same ridges that hide Sorani Kurdish villages, once cradled civilizations lost to time. Names whispered in the dust: the Gudi, the Lalubi, the Halaf. Some of them were called barbarians by the empires they defied. But now we know there was something else. They were ancestors. And the Kurds today, their DNA carries the resonance of those forgotten tribes, not as a memory, but as a presence. The Kurds aren't just genetically unique. They are genetically ancient. And that distinction doesn't come from isolation. It comes from being at the crossroads of the first cities, the first temples, the first myths. They didn't inherit one story. They inherited dozens, woven into one genome. A genome not defined by where it ends, but by where it began. They lived in shadows, but their legacy burns in light, not through myth or memory, but through molecular echoes passed from father to son, generation after generation, untouched by politics, immune to the rewriting of history. When geneticists sequenced the Y chromosomes of Sorani Kurdish men in Sulaymaniyah, they weren't hunting headlines. They were chasing something older, a pattern carved into time. Out of the data, one lineage surged forward like a river fed by ancient springs, haplogroup G2a and E1b1b1b, a genetic thread that runs through stone temples, sun-scorched fields, and buried cities that predate writing itself. This marker, dominant among the Sorani, doesn't speak the language of empires. It whispers in the dialect of early farmers, of the first hands that planted wheat in the Fertile Crescent, of those who turned earth into civilization. The Halaf culture, 6000 BC, a forgotten society that left behind pottery more refined than many modern nations, and tools so advanced, archaeologists still debate their origins. These were not nomads. These were engineers of the Neolithic. And now we know. The bloodline of those Halaf artisans still flows in today's Kurds. G2a and E1b1b1 is not a Kurdish exclusivity, but in them it concentrates. Not by accident, by continuity. A genetic signal that withstood conquests, survived migrations, and endured the long centuries of imperial reshuffling. The Kurdish mountains did not isolate this lineage. They preserved it. And what's more, this ancient haplogroup doesn't end in the Near East. Its echoes ripple out to the Aegean, to Crete, even to southern Italy and parts of the Balkans. Wherever it spread, it carried the toolkit of early civilization, agriculture, metallurgy, and language. But in Kurdistan, it stayed rooted. It multiplied. It evolved, not into something new, but something layered. Because Kurdish DNA isn't a story of transformation. It's a story of conservation. It holds on to threads the rest of the world forgot. And G2a is just one thread, the beginning of a deeper unraveling, a gateway to other haplogroups, each one a doorway into an age when history wasn't written by victors, but stored in the veins of survivors. Beneath the surface of the Sorani genome, another signal began to pulse, quieter than J2, but no less ancient. Haplogroup G2a, P15, a marker buried in time, obscured by war and forgotten chronicles. And yet it survives, hidden in nearly 1 out of every 10 Kurdish men. To most, this code means little. But to geneticists, G2a is a relic, a signature left by the builders of forgotten sanctuaries, by highland clans that watched empires rise and collapse, untouched in their mountain citadels. It links the Kurds to the Gudi, those elusive tribes who swept down from the Zagros in 2150 BCE and shattered the Akkadian Empire. Historians called them uncivilized. The blood says otherwise. The Gudi were not an invasion. They were a return, a reassertion of a lineage older than the cities it conquered. And today, fragments of that same G2a DNA still live, not in a museum, but in the breath of Kurdish children. This is not mythology. It's math. In median-joining genetic networks, Sorani haplotypes don't scatter. They cluster, forming dense, interconnected webs that trace back not to one ancestor, but to several powerful lineages that never broke away from their highland source. The Lulubi, the Carducci, the people of Su, the Kurdi, names scattered through cuneiform tablets, now unified by strands of chromosome 17. Not imagined connections, measurable, testable links. And G2a is not alone. Alongside it, E1b1b1b carves another path, a haplogroup that likely originated in northeast Africa, spread with early pastoralists, and somehow found sanctuary in the mountains of Kurdistan. 16% of Sorani males carry this genetic imprint, rare for the region, yet persistent. It's a reminder that the story of Kurdish origins isn't linear. It loops. It absorbs. It merges. Each haplogroup isn't a flag. It's a footprint. And the Kurds walk a path layered with hundreds of them, preserved not by conquest, but by survival. Where others erased, they remembered. Where others forgot, they carried forward. Not in books. In blood. Long before borders divided nations, before alphabets carved memory into clay, another arrival was stirring, quieter than conquest, but just as enduring. It came not with armies, but with herders and their horses, and it carried a signal still found in the Kurdish genome today. Haplogroups are 1a and R1b. These aren't abstract labels. They're the remains of ancient migrations, the genetic trail left behind by early Indo-European tribes who swept through the steppes of Central Asia and entered the Iranian plateau around 2000 BC. Among the Sorani Kurds, nearly 1 in 5 men carry these our lineages. But unlike in Eastern Europe, where 1a dominates, or Western Europe, where 1b reigns, here they do not displace, they coexist. They're layered among older haplogroups, nestled between G2a and J lineages, forming a mosaic, not a takeover. This pattern defies the simplistic model of replacement. The Indo-Europeans did not erase the genetic landscape of the Zagros, they embroidered it. Their legacy persists not in dominance, but in dialogue. Language followed. The emergence of Iranian tongues, Kurdish among them, mirrors the slow spread of these steppe-born haplogroups. But even here, the change was not absolute. The Kurdish language, though Indo-European, bears echoes of substrates older than itself, words that resist classification, sounds that predate the grammar imposed upon them. And that's where the uniqueness deepens, because while our 1a may whisper of horse-riding clans from the north, and our 1b of Western connections, the Kurdish genome holds them in tension with local continuity. These were not waves that washed away the past, they settled into it. The presence of R2 adds yet another dimension. Less common, yet present, this branch, likely born in South-Central Asia, hints at deeper networks of movement, traders, pastoralists, or forgotten diasporas. Its footprint among the Kurds is small, but persistent, like a distant cousin never fully gone. What emerges is not a clean lineage, but a collision of ancestries, ancient Near Eastern, Central Asian, and Indo-European, all locked in the same genetic vault. And through all of it, one theme remains: fusion without erasure. Not assimilation through force, but evolution through encounter. Kurdish DNA doesn't simplify history. It complicates it, in the best way. When scientists compared Sorani Kurdish YSDR haplotypes to populations across the Middle East, Central Asia, and Europe, the results weren't just surprising, they were disruptive. The closest genetic relatives were not neighboring Arabs, nor distant Europeans. Instead, a very specific cluster emerged: Qatar, Lebanon, Iran, Greece, Azerbaijan, Turkey. None of these regions form a single empire. None share a unified language, but each, in its own way, echoes the ancestral tapestry woven into Kurdish DNA. It wasn't proximity that determined this kinship, it was lineage. Despite borders, despite centuries of shifting politics, the genetic data cut through the noise and pointed to something constant. The Kurds occupy a core space in the human geography of Western and Central Asia. But just as striking were the distances. When compared to Sweden, Denmark, or even Afghanistan, the gap widened. Not slightly, significantly. The Sorani genome separated from these populations like a different continent. The numbers told the story. Genetic distance measured in RST values. Qatar, 0.0042 Denmark, 0.1575, a gulf wider than language, deeper than faith. It was a genetic silence, a divergence born not of isolation, but of sustained local ancestry. This wasn't about being exotic. It was about being rooted. Modernity tried to carve Kurdistan into fragments. One piece for Iraq, another for Iran, slivers to Turkey and Syria. Yet the DNA ignored those borders entirely. On the genetic dendrogram, a visual family tree, Kurds pulled back together. Even as governments divided them, biology reassembled the whole. In that reconstructed map, the Sorani stood alongside Lebanese and Greeks. Not in language, not in culture, in paternal lineage, in the invisible thread passed from father to son across 10,000 years. It is here, in this unspoken genealogy, that the myth of ethnic uniformity collapses. Kurdish identity is not an invention of the modern world. It is an inheritance older than the idea of states themselves. And it's not just ancestry. It's cohesion. In a region fractured by history, the Kurds display one of the most internally consistent genetic patterns ever recorded in the Middle East. They don't belong to the margins. They are the center. And for those who once tried to erase them with ink and treaties, the irony is complete. The genome remembers what the map forgot. There are peoples who carry the memory of their ancestors in songs, in stories, in ruins. And then there are those who carry them in silence, in the invisible strands of their blood. The Kurds are not remembered by monuments. They are remembered by molecules. What emerged from the YSDR network wasn't a scattered diaspora, but a structured constellation. 6 major genetic clusters were identified, each one centered around deeply rooted paternal lines. J1, J2a, G2a, R1a, R1b, E1b1b. These were not borrowed identities. They were inherited, unbroken, unblended, unforgotten. But what made the Sorani distinct wasn't just which haplogroups they carried. It was how many survived. While most populations show a dominance of 1 or 2 lineages, the Sorani preserved complexity, diversity without disintegration. A rare signal emerged, microvariants, subtle alterations in STR markers, unique to certain individuals. Among the Sorani, over 15% carried these genetic quirks. These weren't mutations of randomness. They were markers of continuity, signs that these lineages had remained active, local, uninterrupted across millennia. Some had double alleles at specific loci. Others had off-ladder alleles, variants so rare they fall outside modern genetic frameworks. These aren't errors. They are footprints. Footprints of ancestors who didn't migrate, who didn't mix, who stayed. And that is the anomaly. In a world defined by migration and displacement, the Kurdish genome reflects persistence. The DNA of a people who didn't just survive. They stayed where it began and kept their bloodline intact. Among the null alleles, where certain genetic markers simply vanished, researchers didn't see degeneration. They saw signs of ancient deletions, long passed down, events from thousands of years ago, still imprinted in the chromosomes of living men. This kind of data isn't poetic. It's surgical. It doesn't rely on myth or nationalism. It relies on base pairs and binding sites. And yet, what it reveals is more human than any flag. Because what survives in Kurdish DNA isn't just biology. It's memory. It's the memory of a people who withstood the reshaping of civilizations, the erasures of empire, the silence of exile, and never let go of what was theirs. Not in voice, in code. Maps were drawn and redrawn, flags raised, torn down, and raised again. But none of it altered what flowed beneath the skin. The Kurdish genome did not bend to the designs of empires. It followed its own rhythm, one that ignored the shifting lines on paper. When researchers placed Sorani Kurdish data into global genetic models, the result was not fragmentation. It was cohesion. Against expectations, they clustered not as an outlier, but as a stable core, a consistent identity, genetically distinguishable from both European and African populations. This wasn't just ancestry. It was structure. The YSDR HapMap showed a stability few other Middle Eastern populations retained. While others fragmented under centuries of forced migration and imperial assimilation, the Kurds held the center. Even as different Kurdish dialects formed, Sorani, Kurmanji, Zazaki, Gorani, the underlying DNA retained its signal. The language evolved. The genome endured. Not only did they preserve genetic markers across eras, but they maintained depth, an internal diversity forged over thousands of years, not recent centuries. Their blood held signatures from multiple civilizations, yet remained coherent. It was not a collage. It was a layered manuscript, each page connected to the one before it. And that coherence tells a story political history rarely admits. That identity can survive without a state. That a people scattered by war, neglected by treaties, and dismissed by rulers can still retain a biological unity far stronger than flags or constitutions. There is no other group in Western Asia quite like them. Their population spans 4 modern nations, and yet their genome is more consistent than those of the countries that contain them. That is not coincidence. That is survival under pressure. Every war they endured, every displacement they suffered, failed to erase the ancestral signals encoded in their cells. They did not forget. They did not dissolve. The data shows what politics could not. The Kurds never disappeared. They simply endured in silence, until science made their presence undeniable. And through it all, one fact remains unshaken. Their uniqueness lies not in isolation, but in how much they carried forward. Unchanged, unyielding. Some lineages fade over time, buried beneath conquest and assimilation. Others burn quietly, kept alive not by empires or armies, but by continuity, the kind that doesn't seek attention, the kind that simply refuses to die. In the case of the Kurds, what has survived is more than just genetics. It is presence, in the way they live, in the mountains they still call home, in the rituals that whisper of fire, earth, and ancestry. While others move forward by forgetting, the Kurds move forward by remembering. This is a people whose ancestral code holds traces of nearly every stage of human civilization in the Near East, from Neolithic farmers to Bronze Age highlanders, from early Indo-European speakers to Zoroastrian mystics. Their identity was never singular. It was cumulative. In Sulaymaniyah, the old and the new exist side by side. Young men carry haplotypes linked to tribes older than Babylon, walking city streets lit by neon signs and cell towers. They are the future and the ancient past in the same breath. This isn't just about bloodlines. It's about guardianship. The Kurds, scattered across borders, continue to embody the very genetic diversity that once defined the heart of Mesopotamia. Not because they chose to, but because they never left. Even without a state, they have preserved a heritage that predates the idea of nations, not through revolution, through resilience, not through monuments, through memory passed silently, biologically, unbroken. Every Kurdish child born today carries within them not only the pain of a fractured homeland, but also the full weight of a 9,000-year-old inheritance, a coded record of migrations, conquests, alliances, and survival. Each generation, a living archive. While governments debated their rights, and historians argued their origins, the truth was quietly carried in their cells, loyal to no ruler, answerable to no map, only to time. And if history is the story of what survives, then the Kurds are not a footnote. They are the sentence that never ended. Not every legacy needs a throne. Some are carved in silence, carried not by kings, but by those who endure, unnoticed, unbroken. Across generations, the Kurds have held on to something the world never fully saw. Not just a homeland, not just a language, but a continuity older than memory, deeper than history, written into the marrow of their being. Science has no bias. It doesn't take sides. And when it looked into Kurdish DNA, it didn't find myth or legend. It found evidence. Proof that this people, so often dismissed as fragmented, are in truth among the oldest surviving lineages in the region. They are not recent arrivals. They are not historical shadows. They are a remnant of the original tapestry, not erased, simply overlooked. Every haplogroup, every allele, every microvariant tells the same story, of survival against odds, of heritage preserved without empire, of a people who became the living memory of ancient Mesopotamia. And maybe that's why they were never allowed a flag, because something in their very existence challenged the storylines drawn by others. While lines were being etched across maps, the Kurds were holding on to something far more permanent. Time has always tried to erase. Earthquakes bury cities. Regimes burn manuscripts. Languages vanish from tongues. But what no force could reach was the archive folded deep within the human cell. That's where the Kurds wrote their history, in silence, in patience. So what now? Now we ask ourselves what this legacy means, not just for the Kurds, but for all of us who seek to understand where we come from. Because in their story lies a reminder. Identity isn't built on recognition. It's built on endurance. And perhaps, in this era of noise and forgetting, there's something profoundly powerful in a people who remembered, not through monuments, but through blood. If you've never looked at the world through the lens of DNA before, start here. Look at the Kurds, not as victims, not as rebels, but as keepers of one of the oldest human stories still unfolding. Ask yourself, what stories might your own blood be hiding? And if this journey moved you, share it. Pass it forward. Because some histories deserve more than memory. They deserve to be heard.